I'm Razin Saleh. I'm going to be chairing this panel. Let me introduce our panelists. We have to my immediate left Alan Oxley, who was Australia's ambassador to the GATT and chairman of the GATT Council in the mid-1980s and runs his own consultancy based in Australia. We have High Commissioner Karen May-Hill from Antigua, and we have Crawford Faulkner, who was New Zealand's ambassador to the WTO and chaired the agricultural negotiations, and is now professor at Lincoln University in New Zealand. Now, this panel is on Britain's new relationship with the developing world. Now, that's, of course, a very, very big geographical sphere. In our previous panels, we've talked about the 4 pillars. We've talked about what to do unilaterally, what to do with key bilateral relationships, such as with the United States, key plurilateral relationships as well. What we haven't talked about, and what we're going to talk about now, is some key sets of relationships with developing countries. So, of course, the big emerging markets, China and India, Brazil come to mind. And then some of the really promising advanced middle-income developing countries. And then, crucially, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, the so-called ACP countries, which have a specific set of trade relationships with the European Union. Britain has been part of that, of course. These countries include many ex-British colonies and many ex-French colonies as well. So the really big question here is, with Brexit, what opportunity is there to forge new, different, and hopefully more constructive relationships with these countries? Now, FTAs with India and China perhaps come to mind, Brazil as well through Mercosur. That's one set of rather big issues. But let me just raise 2 or 3 questions on the ACP countries in particular. Now, the big issue for many of the ACP countries is something called preferences and preference erosion. The issue is this. They get preferential access to the EU market with tariffs that are low or reduced to 0, while the tariffs for other countries, the so-called MFN tariffs, remain higher. And their worry is that with Britain leaving the European Union and leaving the common external tariff, that Britain will reduce those tariffs unilaterally and or through free trade agreements with others. So that would reduce the margin of preference for these countries and subject them to competition, especially from more advanced developing countries. So the big question here is what to do about preferences. Now, these preferences, which have been there for a long time, have not delivered the results that were advertised long ago, or advertised even more recently. They have locked these countries into particular areas like bananas and sugar, often in monocultural economies, and prevented them from diversifying into more productive areas that would exploit what comparative advantages they have. At the same time, of course, as Britain leaves the European Union, we have a strong interest here to reduce our tariffs, unilaterally or otherwise, for the benefit not least of British consumers, but also of producers to be more efficient in value chains and so on. So that's one big set of questions around preferences and preference erosion. Another question relates to the so-called economic partnership agreements that the European Union has with different blocks of ACP countries. I think there are 6 EPAs with different sets of countries. These are supposed to be free trade agreements, but they're not they're not strong and certainly not symmetrical free trade agreements like what one would expect between the UK and the EU or between the UK and the United States. The question here is, with Britain leaving the European Union, is there scope for extra liberalization with British EPAs, shall we say, with the ACP countries? Britain, of course, could open its agricultural market to some extent to some of these countries, and that would be of interest to some of these countries, agricultural exporters. And Britain would also be interested in having some of these countries, at least, liberalize their regimes for manufacturing imports. So can something be done there? Third and final question is really on foreign aid, and that's of course a question for the Department for International Development, DFID here. We do administer a lot of aid to the ACP countries. Does it really work? Can we re-engineer that aid to make it work better, not least to assist these countries to do pro-competition, pro-market reforms, not least to diversify their economic base and their trade base? Those are the questions I have for the panel. We're limited in time, so I'd appreciate it if you could keep your initial comments to 4 to 5 minutes, and then we can explore in a round of questions. Let me start with High Commissioner Hill. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. In 2008, the Caribbean would have negotiated its EPA with the EU. And as part of those negotiations, there was a 5-year review clause to measure whether the benefits that should have been derived from this EPA were being seen across the countries. The results were very clear that the EPA benefits were not being seen as fully as one would have liked. There was the clear situation where within the developing countries themselves, there was an unequal distribution of benefits. So where I'm from, Antigua and Barbuda, with 90,000 people, we were even more, in a sense, disadvantaged by the arrangement than bigger Caribbean countries. So it was very clear that on the supply side, with supply constraints, it was very clear with technical capacity that it wasn't working the way that all of us would have liked it to have worked. The consensus in the Caribbean at the moment is that we really ought to be looking at how we can make the EPAs work better. What lessons have we learned from the 2008 to the present experience? And as Britain exits the EU and we consider EPAs with the UK, what can we take forward into that? One of the things that we're pretty clear on, I think, whether we like it or not, is that liberalization, deep liberalization is absolutely needed. And this will also mean removal of tariffs that currently exist that distort the market. Now, the issue though is, if we are going to be moving towards these tariff-free arrangements, what technical capacity, what market research will be done to assist the islands to adjust to the new order? And because many countries derive revenue from customs, duties, and so on, and it's a huge source of revenue for countries in the Caribbean region. And so those will have to be balanced. And I should say really quickly, I don't speak on behalf of any government, not even my own, but just to share some thoughts as to what the thinking is on the ground in the Caribbean at the moment. But we do recognize that what is in place with a system of tariffs, quotas, duties isn't working, and that liberalization necessarily means that these tariffs will have to be removed. But if they are removed, how do we safeguard the interests of the Caribbean in terms of revenue? I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much. Alan?
This is an immensely difficult subject. It's very clear that the systems of support provided through the EU schemes have not been successful. The tendency has been to provide funding for industries which have been job creators and not really to provide support to develop industries and activities which are independently competitive and able to survive in markets without assistance. So your point about dependence on customs duties is very significant. Trying to address these questions raises quite a series of challenges. It's a combination both of aid policy and of long-standing policy by the European community, which I think in the long run has actually been reasonably lazy. It's easier for them to have handed money to developing countries. You talked about bananas and sugar. These were industries which were not inherently competitive in the long run. They're only going to be competitive because they're sold into the EU at high prices protected by EU barriers. Sugar is a very, very outstanding case where developing countries in these programs were earning quite a lot of money from selling sugar onto a price which is set on the European price, but which is only protected inside the European community and was not competitive with sugar produced outside the European community. So it made very little sense to provide development assistance to these countries for industries which are not competitive and were going to be dependent solely on the preferences created by the EU for itself. So with the UK leaving this system, it does raise a question as to what extent it will take the opportunity to try to foster support for industries which will be able to be economically sustainable. This will be a combination of aid projects as well as, I think, a very deliberate thought process on the behalf of the agencies here, working with people in these economies to try to find means by which the industries they develop will be self-sustaining and will generate income in their own countries. Also requires changes in tax structures, which are very difficult. I think to date, the basic problem has frankly just been laziness. It's been too easy for the governments in the EU to hand the money out, to have the regular meetings with the ACP countries, and they, of course, will receive the money, who would not? But it's really created a form of dependence, virtually poverty trap for many of these developing countries. So I think for the UK, it's an opportunity. It will be free of this system. There's, of course, been huge pressure to stay within the EU system. Anybody who stepped aside to be criticised for not helping developing countries, without regard to the inadequate impact that these systems were having in those countries. And I think this is quite an interesting opportunity for the UK to look at this in quite a different light. We often think that aid agencies are the solution. They're not, frankly. I think if you look at the history of aid which has been provided to developing countries, it's a very dismal picture. And part of the reason is that the officials who provide the aid think what's more important is to get the money out rather than actually focus on what will work in their own economy. And too often aid programs seek to engineer sort of a new form of industry which has not been pioneered before. If you think about the common sense of this, it's very low. Quite silly to put money into a developing country to develop a sort of type of industry which hasn't existed before. At the end of the day, it's really got to be the entrepreneurs in that society who will actually take advantage of these systems and try and build industries which are competitive. So I think there's a really interesting challenge here. With the UK not locked into the EU system, it's, I think, an exciting chance to try to, in fact, use these systems and get some self-sustaining growth rather than simply leaving these smaller economies into a system of welfare dependence.
Crawford?
Thanks very much, Razi. My hearing's not quite as good as it used to be. You said I had 45 minutes. Was that what you said? I think if you had 45 minutes, you probably couldn't cover the subject. I certainly couldn't. 4 to 5. Well, first of all, I think I have not many things in common with the High Commissioner, but possibly two. You said that you don't speak on this on behalf of your government. Neither do I. Although when I was employed by the government often said that I wasn't speaking on behalf of them, even when I was in their employ. So that hasn't changed very much. And yes, I like you, am a product of the British colonial system too. But we've moved on a little bit from that in the last few years. And it's worth reflecting on that, because when you deal with a subject as broad as developing countries, you've got to try and have some degree of clarity of which countries you're talking about when it comes to various prescriptions. Excellent. You heard nothing of what happened before, so I'm now going to totally contradict myself. I'm not going to talk about economies like China and India. I mean, I think when it comes to trade policy in relation to them, there's been other discussions where they've really been in focus. So I think what I will call, for want of a better term, advanced developing countries, I don't think this is the best forum to talk about that. I think we're talking about economies whose challenges of development are considerably deeper and broader than those economies are now. Once upon a time they were. And I mentioned in parenthesis that if you look at those economies and the growth and development path they have taken, they have invariably done so by engaging in the global economy and having access to markets in order to achieve, and it's not the sole reason to achieve, their growth and development objectives. There's a big lesson there for everybody, but not everybody, for various reasons, can exactly follow that path. For the UK, in relation to what I would call, there's such politics around how you describe developing countries, even if you are terribly well-intentioned, which of course I am. I'm always well-intentioned. But for economies that are least developed, let's start with that category. I mean, I assume that for the UK, in raw terms, what the UK will do and needs to do, at a minimum, is to ensure that what's called the Everything But Arms Initiative for least developed economies is locked in for the UK vis-à-vis the least developed countries who currently have access to that through the EU. I'm not saying that's the end of the story. I've only got probably about 30 seconds left. But for them, I think that there should be no question that you find a way technically to make that happen so that they are in no sense worse off fundamentally. For other economies, as was mentioned, you have these so-called economic partnership agreements with the ACP economies in particular, and various reasons. Again, you find, and I believe it's possible to find a technical fix to ensure that that is ported across, I believe is the technical term, to the UK, to ensure that the reciprocity that exists in those is at a minimum stabilised. And that does not rule out the possibility of having additional and further negotiations, which would inevitably be reciprocal. And if there's a willingness on the part of the developing country members that are currently in those EPAs to engage in that, I'm sure the UK would, in accordance with its development objectives, quite apart from anything else, be absolutely up for that. So that will be something that really is a demand, one would hope, that will come from those economies themselves. Whether the UK is able to satisfy some or all of those demands is an open question. That will be for negotiation. But you don't put at risk what you already have. The acquis, as the French would say. You try to pocket that and move on. But there are other developing countries in this exercise as well, who are not ACP, and they are often at the same or similar levels of development as the economies in the ACP, and they will not necessarily have the same level of access to the UK market as has been obtained through the EPAs, because the UK, via the EU, hasn't negotiated those bilateral agreements with them. They have, and this is the third category, what is called the GSP, which is a special preferential arrangement for developing economies that don't have very specific arrangements for them. So the UK will have to come up with its own GSP for those economies, and it will have to decide what those preferential rates are for other developing economies. They obviously have the option of replicating what the EU has, but I suspect that they would have ultimately flexibility in that area that might prove somewhat more generous even than what the EU provides under the GSP. But again, that's for future negotiation. I don't think it's fundamentally different. So I say to myself, well, where in all of this? Well, it's technically complicated. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot at stake. It's one thing to be worrying about a 2 or 3% tariff if you're a major industrialised economy. It can be a matter of life and death for some developing economies, and the subsidies that are provided by rich economies can be a matter of life and death, and certainly the difference between poverty and gradual growth for a number of economies. So it's always worth bearing in mind that the challenges, both physical and developmental and moral, are rather different, and you have to calibrate your approach accordingly. But preference erosion, which you mentioned particularly by Razin, often comes up in this discussion. You know, preference erosion is an inevitable consequence of countries reducing their MFN tariffs. Why do countries reduce their MFN tariffs? So that they can grow and develop themselves. And what's best for any economy that wants to trade with those economies, whether they're lesser developed countries, least developed or less developed economies, they want to have the expansion that comes from those economies growing. So it's not as if the liberalisation that you grant at the most favoured nation level to improve your own growth prospects is somehow always inimical to a preference-receiving economy. It's part of the story for how those markets, which are the target markets, will grow and add wealth to those developing economies. So I think the idea that somehow the preference erosion is an issue is to target the wrong problem. I think it's a genuine concern that a number of poorer developing countries have, which is that it will erode something that they have been used to, and that their capacity to adjust is more fundamental to their society than it is for an advanced industrial economy. And in the WTO negotiations, and more generally, there's something that deals with that, which is actually what economists would say properly targeted, a first best solution, called aid for trade. It's not just aid generally, it's aid for trade, which is precisely targeted at providing additional measures that will be able to assist economies who are trading into markets to be able to take advantages of the market opportunities that are there through MFN, and indeed to help them adjust if there are adjustment problems for them that are a consequence. So it's not the whole solution, but I think it's a very significant part of the solution. So if you can have a liberalising approach, and when the UK enters into free trade agreements, when the EU has entered into free trade agreements, with whether it's with the US or with any other developed economy, that will erode those preferences in any case. It's not as if the UK is going to be doing something that's absolutely novel and new. It's going on all the time. So the answer is you have the kind of targeted trade facilitation, marketing assistance, proper investment policies, an emphasis in particular on the bottlenecks that there are in those developing economies that impede them within their own economy from being able to be efficient traders. That's where you go for. You go for the infrastructure in those areas, good ports, good roads, and rule of law. I mean, these are fundamental things to performance. So you have a much more targeted set of policies in the aid for trade space, and I know the UK differed being involved in that, and there's every reason now that the UK will have control eventually of its own budget, if there's anything left after Monsieur Barnier has posited his bill for other things. Now, they will be able to do that themselves. They won't necessarily have to do it just through the EU Commission, and that will be something which I think is far more important in the picture than any of the other anxieties that people have. Easier for me to say, but I think that's the storyline that we need to grapple with.
Thank you, Crawford. I think you've just exhausted your 45 minutes. Everything but arms, that package, which is about tariff-free, quota-free access for the least developed countries, reminds me of something our friend Rod Abbott in Brussels once called, he calls it the Venus de Milo package, because it's got everything but arms. Now, several, but I'll store them for later. Let me get back to you, High Commissioner, to elaborate on your opening comments. What would a much better EPA for the Caribbean look like between the Caribbean and the United Kingdom compared to the status quo with the European Union? What kinds of sectors would you like to see the Caribbean economies diversify into? And perhaps you could give us and the audience some flavor of Antigua itself and what it's been doing.
If I could just begin by commenting on something that was said by my fellow panelists about the infrastructure and the need to focus on having the ports, the fact that you can sail from one island to the next with goods or fly at a cost-effective way. That requires aid for trade, as you rightly said. But one of the challenges that we consistently face in the islands of the Caribbean is that we are graduated out of access to concessional financing under the DAC criteria. And we're told that our arguments about vulnerability, about resilience, do not come into play because Bill Gates lands in Antigua and he jacks up our GDP per capita, and that makes us too rich to have assistance. So we consistently face the challenge that the Caribbean countries, but for the EU in some respects, which has been actually a more faithful partner to the Caribbean than many other developed countries, we do not have access to the types of concessional financing that will propel our economies. I also want to make the point that in Antigua's case, Mr. Chair, we're 35 years old. We turned 35 last year. These are still baby economies. I know Singapore is relatively young as well, but 52. But we are very young, and so And we have actually prioritized and protected the rule of law and good governance, but haven't really seen any real recognition of the fact that we've done these things in the way that aid, for example, technical support is distributed from the bigger countries. I'm also keen to put in really quickly that what we're looking at in the future is ways that we can sustain our economies. Take the issue of de-risking, for example, where Caribbean financial centers, the Caribbean financial space is being cut off from traditional banking because we're told that we're too high risk. If you can't move money, you can't trade, you can't develop your trade. And right now, the World Bank study of 2 years ago says that the Caribbean is being disproportionately affected by this de-risking phenomenon, which we can talk about a little bit more. One last thing I'll say at this point, when you spoke about areas that we're thinking about in the Caribbean, the blue economy that countries like Seychelles and the Mauritius have been really expanding on is of particular interest to us at the moment when we recognize that the definition of small in the Caribbean context is being reversed when one considers the extent of the ocean space that is ours. So by 2050, we're told the world population will be 9 billion. Land-based forms of protein will not be sufficient to meet the demands for that population in a few years' time. Perhaps fish and ocean stocks will become particularly important parts of our economies in the future. Our shipping, wave energy, and thermal energy, and all of these areas, like Nevis right now, there's thermal energy being developed to service many of the islands. We would need in the Caribbean the sort of support that identifies with us the industries of the future and gives us that support you're speaking about to develop them and nurture them, but not cut the hands off as soon as we have a little bit of success and say that you've graduated. Because one hurricane, as Dominica found out 2 years ago, with 12 inches of rain in 3 hours, wiped out 80% of Dominica's GDP in 3 hours. But of course, Dominica is too rich to receive any sort of aid. So it got 5 seconds airtime in the US, none in the UK, and Dominica struggles on. And so these are some real challenges that we have. But at the same time, I think I must repeat that we do not wish to be locked into a cycle where we have to constantly rely on people's handouts and through aid or whatever else you call it. This aid must be mobilized to build effective systems and structures that create longevity, sustainability, and that is currently not the case.
We have just over 5 minutes before 2 minutes? Haven't we got until 10 to 5? Okay, thanks. Right, so let's open up the discussion to questions from the audience. Who would like to start? Don't be shy. No, well, while people are thinking of, at least one person is thinking of a question, let me get back to Alan and Crawford. I mean, I take it from your comments and from your comments as well, High Commissioner, that preferences should not be the issue. That we should look at non-trade mechanisms to deal with whatever problems are out there. But there is a political issue. Some ACP governments do raise the issue of preferences. There's perhaps the prospect that they might cause problems for the UK in the WTO with its rectification process, which we talked about in the first panel. If the UK intends to go ahead with tariff liberalization once it comes out of the common external tariff. Is this a serious prospect? And what should the UK line be? Should it be very definite, very firm, that this is not something that's going to be held hostage, that we will go ahead with our tariff liberalization anyway, and we will look for other means to try and address the problems you have? Any thoughts on that?
Okay, I'll go into extra time. Look, I mean, easy for me to say, but I mean, because I'm not the UK government, but I would have thought the first thing you do is you listen. It's one of the first things you do, rather than say, we know what's good for you. So I see no reason to believe that the UK government isn't doing that. That usually is a good start. You might have the view, and I would imagine that that would be the basic view, which is ultimately you can't let your preference margins get in the way of good reasons for liberalisation at the MFN level. But of course you will listen to hear what the anxieties are. And there's no technical blockage in what you call the WTO rectification procedure, because there's no requirement in the WTO to maintain margins of preference. That's certainly legally the case. But in political terms, if you're dealing with particularly small and vulnerable economies who believe they have a problem, you listen to what that problem is and you sit down and you see whether you can figure out something that can deal with it. And if you can't, then you have to say, look, we can't deal with it this way or this way, but maybe we can find this other solution to your particular problem. But let's not create an assignment problem by trying to use a WTO institution to solve a problem that really has nothing much to do with the WTO, but more to do with fundamental developmental questions, or how you are generally treated, or whether you have the capacity to operate in the market. So that's kind of where I would come from on this. And, you know, I mean, when you think about it, the WTO has actually always been about preference erosion. When you liberalise your most favoured nation tariff, that's what you do. I think in many ways it's understandable post-Brexit that a number of economies will be absolutely aware that's a big change, and they will be in a period where they're not too sure what it all means. And fortunately, there's a couple of years, a little bit less than that now, where those issues can be addressed. But I would be very surprised if what you've described as preference erosion is fundamentally the issue. I think there's a much more challenging set of questions that the High Commissioner has raised, and I used to work in the government and was very familiar with small island economies and their problems, and the way in which you had to have an understanding and flexible way to deal with it, and you had to deal with the impact of climate and many other things on those economies, and you couldn't just go back to what the menu was last week. You had a responsibility to be adaptable to that, but you also had to play by the rules. And you do it by a clear understanding of what trade policy can and cannot do. And I think that's the way you should operate. This may seem sunnily optimistic, and I think that we've bits along the way where it becomes perhaps problematic at times. But for the big ticket items, for the reasons that have been described, I mean, UK development policy may well find that it's able to respond more flexibly and quickly and in a more understanding way when it's able to operate on its own. I mean, it won't only operate on its own. I mean, the UK is going to be a major donor in multilateral institutions and presumably with Europe as well. But it will also have a capacity to do things itself. And there's nothing that gets a reaction quicker than a ministerial conversation. And the UK will now have ministers who are able to react to that, minister to minister. It's potentially a positive change.
Thanks, Crawford. Anything to add, Alan?
Well, I just want to repeat the point that I made at my initial beginning. I think we sometimes overstate the significance of cuts in tariffs in WTO agreements or being able to then drive economic growth in poorer developing countries. The Aid for Trade programs, by and large, are a failure. And they're mainly put together by governments who say, well, we've done something for development. When I come back to the point I made before, providing the sort of assistance which helps developing countries is far more complicated and difficult and does not principally often depend upon some sort of tariff cut or some sort of reduction of some sort of support. That's why the point I made before is that this is a very good opportunity. Now, there's a certain laziness about all this. It's easy for WTO, when I think not much else to do, have big programs and discuss these things. But in fact, the reality is, I think, as you've described, the sorts of issues that are significant for growth and development are things that actually need to be worked on and worked through with the aid agencies. Now, I've said before, most aid is actually ineffective. It's often dreamed up by people sitting in aid agencies and come along with programs to say, we can do this for you and do that for you. Aid, in fact, is extremely difficult. Trying to take some external action to promote growth in another country is a huge challenge. I think this is an opportunity for the UK to move away from the established processes by which this is done, because people take a lot of comfort saying we gave the country this amount of money last year and next year and so on. and actually turn to the real issues, some of them which you've proposed, to say, well, what programs will actually make a significant difference? And there's a certain orthodoxy in Brussels. They like to write the reports and say that they're doing lots of things. And I think it's time to move away from that. And I think the opportunities created here for the UK are quite significant.
Thank you. Well, I think we've run out of time. So please join me in thanking the panelists.